President, as this mammoth bill is being considered, there's some ramifications that go beyond just the fiscal impact of this bill and the prudence of those measures, but it's also about the policy implications of some of the things that have been woven into this bill. I'm particularly referring to issues relating to our relationship with Cuba. And you know, this Senate has debated over many years issues relating to Cuba, a close neighbor, unfortunately over the last half century, not a friendly neighbor. And I think back about 1898 when this Senate was very much in favor of Cuba's freedom from Spain, and American forces intervened, and in 1902 the freedom of Cuba was, as an independent nation, free from Spain, was granted as a result of actions by our Congress as well as our presidents. But as the Senate considers taking steps that would change the current approach to policy regarding Cuba, we should reflect on how and why we have the current policy in place and the ramifications of adjusting that policy at this moment in time, even temporarily. As U.S.-Cuba policy as a living, breathing entity, over the years it has been adjusted, loosened, tightened, and tested. 10 successive U.S. presidents have affirmed the policy bolstering provisions for the sake of those brutalized by the regime, seeking no harm to the general Cuban public, while denying the regime the resources it so desperately needs to keep a stranglehold on power. The U.S. has always had the general welfare of the Cuban people in mind, as evidenced by our generous humanitarian aid and the promises of untethered assistance. The United States is the #1 supplier of humanitarian aid to Cuba. The American people in 2007 alone sent $240 million in private assistance through reputable humanitarian assistance organizations. The foundation of our policy takes its aim at the actions of the regime that expropriated private property without compensation, property owned by American citizens. On top of this foundation is our message that Cubans deserve access to free and fair elections, basic human rights, and the rule of law. The U.S. built this policy so as to stand with the Cuban people who are denied the freedoms we as Americans receive as a birthright. As we consider stripping enforcement of the sanctions, I would like to spend some time talking about what it is that this policy means to the Cuban people, the American government, and me personally as someone who witnessed the violence of this revolution firsthand. U.S.-Cuba relations during the Castro era have largely been defined by Cuba's record of anti-Americanism and aggressive acts of hostility. When Fidel Castro took power in the early days of 1959, there were promises of democracy, free press, and elections, but such reforms never took place, and in fact, a violent dictatorial regime came in its place. Many executions took place, killings without trial, without due process. Our president then, Dwight D. Eisenhower, built a framework for the anti-Castro policy by placing trade sanctions on sugar, oil, and guns. When barrels of Soviet oil began to arrive in Havana, U.S. oil companies in Cuba refused to continue refining oil, paving the way for further nationalization of U.S. assets, oil refineries in this instance. All of these nationalizations took place without compensation to American companies, and to this day, there never has been compensation. All of the properties owned by Americans were taken. Later, little by little, property owned by Cubans were taken until there was no vestige of private property left in Cuba whatsoever. My own personal story, my own life was touched as I was a young boy when all of this took place. Ultimately, as a result of persecution of those of us who were people of faith, as well as the stifling atmosphere of a totally controlled society, I, as a teenager, immigrated to the United States. And I watched firsthand the tensions between Cuba and the United States from a very personal way. I remember watching the television news accounts of tensions rising between the United States and Cuba, escalating and leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That began in July of 1962 when Raúl Castro went to Moscow and the bonds between Cuba and Russia were strengthened. The Castro brothers engaged with Russia and agreed to allow the Soviets to deploy nuclear missiles under Moscow's jurisdiction on the island of Cuba. By the fall of 1962, Soviet freighters began delivering shipments of middle-range ballistic missiles. In an address to the nation on October the 22nd of 1962, coincidentally on the eve of my 16th birthday, President John Kennedy warned of the imminent danger presented by emerging Soviet-Cuba alliance. In describing Cuba's nuclear capabilities, Kennedy said, and I quote, "Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, and any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area." 5 days later, in a letter to Russian Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev, Fidel Castro offered the island in sacrifice and urged the Soviet to make an unwarranted first strike with nuclear weapons upon the United States. Let's be clear. The Castro regime under Fidel and Raul Castro, who was his defense minister, then as they are today, both in power still, wanted a first strike nuclear attack against the United States. Fidel Castro urged the Russians to let the missiles fly toward our soil. Fortunately for all, Khrushchev's response to Castro was to urge patience, firmness, and more firmness. And these events were the foundations for U.S.-Cuba policy. Brutality, the theft of U.S. assets, and the threat of nuclear catastrophe, all of these things perpetrated by the Castro brothers, who were in power in '59 and who remain in power today. In the years between the Cuban Missile Crisis and now, the United States has made several good faith efforts to attempt unilateral engagement with Cuba and restore some measure of relations. Without fail, every single attempt has failed due to the actions of the Castro regime. Several attempts involve our offering concessions similar to those that the bill before us today offers. In 1975, Secretary of State Kissinger, during President Gerald Ford's presidency, tried to broker a deal with Cuba that would have lifted the trade sanctions and normalized relations. But the regime chose another route. It wanted to project power abroad. It was more interested in acting as a surrogate of the Soviets than it was in better relations with the United States. So Cuba sent troops to Angola, and these troops engaged in a war as surrogates of the Soviet Union, where Cuban men died and where the Cuban armed forces were engaged in battle. They seized the capital of Luanda, and the group then proclaimed independence from Portugal. In an effort to promote peace and stability, Secretary Kissinger had no choice but to tell Cuba that as long as they had troops in Africa, the deal to normalize relations would be off the table. This wasn't the only time in the presidency of President Carter in 1980. Good faith efforts were again undertaken by our government, by our president and his administration. These again were rebuffed in a different way this time. This time it was as a result of the desire of Cuban people to live freely, where more than 10,000 Cubans had come into the Peruvian embassy seeking political asylum. As a result of that, Fidel Castro at the time said that they could all flee. President Carter said they'd be welcome into our country. More than 125,000 Cubans fled to freedom under what became known as the Mariel boat lift. But besides doing that, in a very cynical way, Fidel Castro emptied jails and mental hospitals of people who were put on these boats and sent to the United States. Some of them are still in our jails today because they will not accept them back. That act of hostility was symbolic of, number one, the desire of the Cuban people to live freely and the flight of people from Cuba to friendlier places, but also of the frustrating nature of any attempts to have a better relationship with the Cuban government. In February of 1982, the United States Secretary of State added Cuba to the list of countries supporting international terrorists. The U.S. State Department issued a report detailing Cuba's activities. The State Department asserted that Cuba had, and I quote, encouraged terrorism in the hope of provoking indiscriminate violence and repression in order to weaken government legitimacy and attract new converts to the armed struggle. Cuba was noted to have very active operations throughout Central America, and especially in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. It was reportedly providing advice, safe haven, communications, training in Cuba, and some financial support to several violent South American organizations. The long record of Cuba's government lack of respect for human life extends beyond the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. At another time, when then President Clinton was looking for ways to reach a rapprochement with the Cuban government, three United States citizens and an American resident of the United States were murdered in the air when an organization known as Brothers to the Rescue were conducting humanitarian flights looking for those who would seek to escape tyranny by taking to small boats and rafts in a very treacherous crossing across Florida. So on February the 26th of 1996, in international waters, the Cuban Air Force, under the command of Raul Castro, today's leader of Cuba, fired upon this unarmed aircraft, causing the death of 3 U.S. citizens, Armando Alejandro Jr., Carlos Costa, Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales, who was not a citizen but was a legal resident of our country. This was a humanitarian-based group called Brothers to the Rescue, a group credited with spotting and saving the lives of thousands of Cubans in the Florida Straits. Following a thorough investigation, it was determined the regime premeditated the shoot-down as part of a conspiracy called Operation Scorpion, a mission designed to send a message to the Cuban exile community. In the months leading up to the shoot-down, Cuban piloted MiG jets practiced intercepting and firing on slow-moving planes, similar to those flown by Brothers to the Rescue. Further, the regime infiltrated an agent into Brothers to the Rescue for the sole purpose of encouraging the group to fly into the regime's death trap. This agent disappeared the day before the shoot-down and reappeared in Havana to denounce the humanitarian group. The Southern District of Florida would eventually find and charge 14 individuals, including Cuban spies. The reaction from the international community was swift and was harsh. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution condemning Cuba. The European Union followed suit. Here in the United States, we strengthened sanctions against Cuba through the Helms-Burton Act. A known state sponsor of terror, the Cuban regime engaged in premeditated murder in international airspace. And the same people who orchestrated this unprovoked attack on civilian aircraft that were unarmed, Fidel and Raul Castro, still govern Cuba today. Incidents such as these strengthen the resolve of Cubans looking for a better life. Many have fled for our shores. During the early days of the regime, in the 59 to 1962 timeframe, over 200,000 refugees were settled in the United States. There are well over 1.5 million refugees in the United States, many more in Spain, Mexico, throughout Latin America, and frankly, many are in the Eastern Bloc nations where they oftentimes went during the time of the Soviet Union. The Cuban diaspora has gone escaping tyranny and seeking freedom. According to the State Department, I quote, "These includes former political prisoners, persecuted religious minorities, human rights activists, forced labor conscript, and those discriminated against or harmed based on their political or religious beliefs. Those who choose to stay behind or courageously oppose the regime radical ways are subject to violence, torture, and even murder." According to Armando Lago, an economist who has attempted to compile a list of every person killed since the start of the Cuban Revolution, Raul Castro was personally responsible for over 550 executions in 1959 alone, executed without trial, without cause, and without mercy. Raul Castro is the figurehead of Cuba's modern regime. Lago has documented 500 murders by prison guards, deaths from medical neglect in the hundreds, suicides of political prisoners, and more than 1,000 assassinations and disappearances. Under the Cuban Criminal Code, the regime has legal authority to detain and arrest anyone deemed not in line with the communist state. These individuals are defined under Article 103 of the Cuban Criminal Code as, and I quote here, "any person who incites against the social order, international solidarity, or the communist state by means of oral or written propaganda or any other way prepares, distributes, or possesses propaganda. Any person who disseminates false news or malicious predictions while to cause alarm or discontent among the population or public order, or any person who permits utilization of the mass communications media shall be punished with 1 to 4 years imprisonment. Once in prison, these individuals are subjected to unsanitary conditions, harassment, and beatings. Here are just a few of the conditions reported by Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The nutrition and hygienic situation, together with the deficiencies on medical care, continue to be alarming and have caused numerous medical problems among the prison population. Anemia, diarrhea, skin diseases, and also parasitism due to polluted water appear to be commonplace in the majority of the country's prisons, while in some, such as Manacas and El Combinado del Este facilities, cases of tuberculosis have been recorded. Moreover, inmates who have made any form of protest about the treatment received or who reject re-education, which according to information received consist of political and ideological training, have been subjected to reprisals such as beatings, being shut up in punishment cells, which are very, very small cells with the door closed, where a prisoner can be kept for months without seeing the light of day, being transferred to prisons normally far from their families, suspension of family visits, or denial of medical treatment. This is in sharp contrast to the much publicized detention facility at Guantanamo. I have visited Guantanamo. The humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross can visit Guantanamo. That's the only jail in Cuba that can be visited by an international organization like the Red Cross. The Cuban government refuses any human rights organizations from visiting their prisons. Their gulag continues today unchecked and would continue even in spite of us reaching out through this bill in this misguided way. Just last week, the United States State Department 2008 report on human rights said that the Cuban government continued to deny citizens their basic human rights and committed numerous serious abuses. The government denies citizens the right to change their government. Describing these abuses of human rights, the report states, and I quote, "The following human rights problems were reported: beatings and abuse of detainees and prisoners, including human rights activists, carried out with impunity, harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, including denial of medical care, harassment, beatings, and threats against political opponents by government recruits, mobs, police, and state security officials. Arbitrary arrest and detention of human rights advocates and members of independent professional organizations, denial of fair trial and interference with privacy, including pervasive monitoring of private communications." The report notes several limitations on freedom of speech and press, denial of peaceful assembly and association, restrictions on freedoms of movement, including selective denial of exit permits to citizens and the forcible removal of persons from Havana to their original hometowns, restrictions on the freedom of religion, and refusal to recognize domestic human rights groups or permit them to function legally. This is just a long litany of the problems with human rights that exist in Cuba. The fact is that in these conditions, we would dare not have a free trade agreement with Colombia because of concerns about human rights. President Obama, during his campaign, indicated that he was concerned about the human rights condition in Colombia, and so therefore he would not be for a free trade agreement with Colombia. It would seem to me that to be consistent, he would have to veto this bill if in fact it contains a relaxation of relations of trade with Cuba, particularly if it gets into the area of providing credits, which is what this bill would do to those in Cuba who do not pay their bills. The fact is that there have been some pretend changes in Raul Castro's regime since he took over Cuba. Citizens are allowed to use cell phones. Well, that sounds like a great thing. The problem is that if the average Cuban makes $17 a month, the average cell phone in Cuba costs about $64, with the activation fee as high as $120, never mind the contract fee on a month-to-month basis. Another change, Cuban citizens can now stay in hotel rooms that have historically been reserved only for tourists. The problem is that hotel rooms cost as much as 11 times the average monthly salary of a Cuban. These are not changes. These are sham assurances aimed at hiding the regime's struggle to remain financially solvent. One clear change that has occurred on the rise of short-term arrest for so-called dangerous activity. Arbitrary detentions of pro-democracy activists have increased 5 times, from 325 in 2007 to 1,500 in 2008. These are just those that have been documented. Hundreds more, I'm sure, take place that would be difficult to document because they happen in parts of the country where our diplomats certainly are not allowed to travel, and certainly there are no human rights organizations that can monitor it. The regime's promise for change has fallen short of what the Cuban people want and deserve. Where are the anticipated reforms? There have been 2 years of Raul's rule and nothing has happened. Even the most modest calls for reform go unanswered. Since the average Cuban earns $17 a month, but prices of goods and services are almost what they are here, many families find it very difficult to get by. For those Cubans who have family members living abroad, here in the U.S. or Spain or elsewhere, they can receive remittances without a government penalty. But the Cuban government, unlike any other government in the world, takes 20% from any incoming money. If a person living in the United States sends funds to Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, or China, you can expect to pay a private transaction fee of somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5%. The Cuban government takes a 20% cut right off the top. And in this bill, we will unilaterally be letting the Cuban government receive unlimited remittances, asking them to do nothing, unilaterally lifting the restrictions on remittances while asking the Cuban government to do nothing. Wouldn't it be nice if we were to tell the Cuban government that in exchange for allowing them to now receive unlimited remittances, which may not be a bad thing, that then they should in fact act in a way that allows the poor people of Cuba and those here sacrificing to send them help not be taking a 20% cut from the monies that they send to their relatives and loved ones in Cuba. These are not measures designed to serve the interests of the Cuban people. But there's another yet darker side to this regime, is the anti-Americanism and the antagonism to our country that has exemplified the actions of this regime throughout its time. Cuba, in his anti-Americanism, has fallen in line with Venezuela. Mr. President, I ask that I be a unanimous consent, I be allowed to have 5 additional minutes to conclude my remarks.
Without objection.
The relationship between the United States and Cuba, Venezuela and Cuba, very close, and obviously designed in their alliance to exercise an anti-American policy. But it doesn't stop there. It also includes the very dangerous government of Iran. Fidel Castro visited Iran in 2001. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited Cuba in 2006, following a visit in 2000 by then-President Khatami. The fact is that Chavez is in and out of Cuba regularly. The fact is that these governments are functioning as an alliance of sorts in the region, trying to thwart and provoke an anti-American attitude. Before voting on this spending bill, we ought to give serious consideration to what changing the United States policy towards Cuba would mean going forward. While some may feel U.S. policy is punitive, it was created with the interest of the Cuban people in mind. Relaxing restrictions and allowing additional remittances would provide the regime with additional revenue, cash that would help maintain its repressive policies. According to the Cuban asset control regulations, a person visiting members of their immediate family who is a Cuban national for a period of not to exceed 14 days, those are allowed today once every 3 years. What's likely to happen under these proposed changes in the Omnibus is a spiked increase in tourist travel under the guise of humanitarian activity. That doesn't serve the interest of the Cuban people and those who seek freedom inside of Cuba. In addition to that, this legislation before us would extend credit through the U.S. banking system to a Cuban nation that recently disclosed it owes more than $29 billion to the Paris Club, a debt where they've stopped making payments back in the 1980s. In fact, Cuba is the second worst credit of any nation in the world. And to that country, we now are proposing in this legislation, in these financial times we're living in, to provide the Cuban government with credit. They can purchase agricultural goods in this country and also medicine, in fact, to the tune of some $780 million a year, and they've been doing just fine paying cash on the barrelhead. This bill will give them credit. Why would we do that to this Cuban government? Why would we do that to this enemy of the United States when we wouldn't sign and ratify a free trade agreement with a country like Colombia, who is a friend, a partner, and an ally? As we consider changing U.S. policy regarding Cuba, why are we doing it in a way where we ask for nothing? We tie neither of the changes called for in this omnibus to any yardstick of improvement. We don't call for the release of political prisoners. We don't call for lowering of the remittances from 20% to something more reasonable. We don't ask for any signs of positive behavior. We just lay the changes out there and then hope for the best. That's not the way we ought to approach a regime that has rebuffed our overtures for normal relations, humanitarian aid, and instead seeks to undermine our alliances and our interest in the region. The fact is, the Cuban government is no friend of the United States. This is not just some benign dictator in Latin America. This is a government that purposefully, during the entire time that it has existed, has had an antagonism and has exhibited every type of hostility towards the United States, which it continues to exhibit to this day. Now, there are those who believe that Raul Castro was a reformer. After 2 years in power, as I pointed out early, little or no reforms have taken place. Great hopes were raised by him, with many who are just hoping for some sign. Yesterday, those signs of change were even further dashed when he had a major shakeup in his government, and Carlos Laje, who has been essentially the prime minister of the Cuban government, and one of those people that folks believe was in fact a reformer. And the hopes were all pinned that if Laje would take over, that he might be the next president. In fact, he was just fired yesterday, and he's no longer any sign of hope for undermining change in Cuba. In fact, what happened yesterday in Cuba, by any other standard, by any other measure in any other country, would be considered a military coup. We already have a totalitarian system. Now Raul Castro has put all of his friends from the military, all aging people in their 70s and older, as close to him as he can put them. Some of the most radical, the most vicious of those who have enforced Cuba's totalitarian regime over the years that it has existed are now in the throes of government. So essentially what we have here is not an example of a changing regime, but one that is only consolidating power, trying to only exact more repression from his people, while at the same time exhibiting hostility and anti-Americanism anywhere that it goes and anywhere that it speaks. So I would hope that we could have this debate outside of this omnibus bill, because it really would be great to have a discussion about what our policy ought to be on Cuba, not to have it lumped into this massive spending measure that has to be passed by Friday. I would love for us to talk about Cuba in terms of how we encourage respect for human rights, how we encourage this government to behave as a normal, law-abiding nation. The fact is that this unilateral act, which frankly would not be met with any reciprocity, is a mistake. It is a sign that we are trying now to legislate policy in a bill that is about spending and a very dramatic change in United States foreign policy. Mr. President, I thank you for time. I yield the floor